Michael was a 16-year-old boy with a heart as warm as the little town he called home was cold in winter. Life for him and his family wasn't easy. His father worked long hours at the factory, while his mother, battling health issues, managed the household as best she could. They lived paycheck to paycheck. But Michael had learned early on that kindness didn't cost a thing. Every winter, when the streets were buried under heavy snow, he would grab his shovel and set out to clear driveways and sidewalks, earning a few extra dollars to help his family. One frigid morning, as Michael trudged through the snow, his eye caught the familiar sight of Mrs. Cartwright's house. It stood at the end of the street, a grand but weathered Victorian with chipped paint and sagging shutters. Mrs. Cartwright, the oldest resident in town, lived there alone. She was a private woman, known for her sharp tongue and no-nonsense demeanor, but Michael had always found her intriguing. As he approached her driveway, he saw her struggling to open the front door against a snowdrift. Her frail frame was bundled in layers, but even from a distance, Michael could see her shaking from the cold. Without a second thought, he hurried over. "Good morning, Mrs. Cartwright," he called out, raising his shovel. "Need some help?" She turned, her expression a mix of surprise and mild irritation. "Michael, you shouldn't be out in this cold," she said, though her voice softened as she added, "But yes, I suppose I could use a hand." Michael grinned. "Consider it done." As he worked, Mrs. Cartwright stood on the porch, occasionally offering pointed advice. "Don't just clear the middle. Make a proper path to the steps," she instructed. Despite her brisk tone, Michael could sense a quiet gratitude beneath it. When he finished, she tried to hand him a few dollars, but he shook his head. "No need, Mrs. Cartwright," he said. "It's just nice to help." She looked at him for a long moment, her sharp eyes softening. "You remind me of my husband," she said quietly. "He was kind like you, always willing to lend a hand, no matter the circumstances." Michael didn't know what to say, so he simply smiled. "Well, I'll check in on you the next time it snows," he offered. Mrs. Cartwright hesitated, then nodded. "That would be nice. Thank you." From that day on, Michael made a point to visit her whenever the snow fell. Sometimes he found small envelopes of cash tucked into his coat pocket when he wasn't looking, but more often than not, he left with nothing more than a cup of tea and a story from her past. Mrs. Cartwright shared snippets of her life during these visits, opening up in a way that surprised even herself. She told Michael about her years as a schoolteacher, the children she had taught, and her late husband Henry. She also revealed, with a wistful smile, that she had never had children of her own. "It just wasn't in the cards," she said. "So when Henry passed, it was just me." Michael felt a pang of sadness at her words. He couldn't imagine how lonely that must have been, especially in the big, empty house she now occupied. Determined to brighten her days, he started visiting more often, shoveling her driveway, running small errands, and even fixing the squeaky gate in her yard. Life at home, meanwhile, was growing harder. His father's hours at the factory were reduced, and his mother's health continued to decline, leaving them with mounting bills. Michael worked odd jobs after school to help, but there was never quite enough. Despite this, he never let his struggles dampen his spirit. He found solace in his visits to Mrs. Cartwright, whose sharp wit and stories gave him a sense of purpose. One snowy evening, as Michael sat in her parlor sipping tea, Mrs. Cartwright looked at him thoughtfully. "You know, Michael," she said, "you're like the grandson I never had." Michael's cheeks flushed. "That means a lot, Mrs. Cartwright. I'm glad I can help." She reached across the table, her gnarled hand resting on his. "You've done more than help," she said softly. "You've reminded me that there's still kindness in the world." As winter turned to spring, their bond grew deeper, though Michael never expected anything in return for his kindness. To him, Mrs. Cartwright wasn't just an elderly neighbor, she was a friend who had taught him the value of connection and compassion. Little did he know, her gratitude ran far deeper than he could have imagined, and her plans for him would soon reveal themselves in a way that would change his life forever. As the snow melted and the first signs of spring emerged, Michael's visits to Mrs. Cartwright became less about shoveling snow and more about companionship. Their conversations grew longer, and Michael found himself drawn into her world, a world filled with memories of a life that had been both full and lonely. She told him about the books she loved, the students who had made her proud, and the travels she and her late husband had dreamed of but never pursued. One day, as Michael was helping her organize the bookshelves in her parlor, he stumbled upon an old photo album. Its leather cover was cracked with age, and the corners of the photographs inside were curled. "May I?" he asked, holding it up. Mrs. Cartwright nodded. "Go ahead. That's my life in there, or what feels like 100 lifetimes ago." Michael flipped through the pages, marveling at the black and white snapshots of a younger Mrs. Cartwright, always smiling beside a tall, kind-looking man who he guessed was Henry. There were photos of classroom scenes, travel brochures tucked between pages, and a few holiday cards addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Cartwright. "You two looked so happy," Michael said, glancing at a photo of her and Henry dancing at what appeared to be a wedding. "We were," she replied softly. Henry had a way of making the simplest moments feel special. He always said life was about how much light you could bring to others, even when your own days felt dark. Michael nodded, his thoughts drifting to his own family's struggles. "That's a good way to live." Mrs. Cartwright's eyes grew misty as she looked at him. "You're living it, Michael," she said. "You've got that same light he did." The comment stayed with Michael. Though he didn't think of himself as anything special, he realized how much their time together meant to her and to him. It was more than just helping with chores or running errands. It was about the connection they had built, the quiet understanding that came from truly listening and caring for one another. At home, however, things were becoming more difficult. His mother's health declined further, and his father's long hours at the factory seemed to drain the life out of him. Michael took on more odd jobs, working late into the evenings and studying by the dim light of a kitchen lamp. But no matter how tired he was, he always made time for Mrs. Cartwright. One afternoon, as they sat on her porch watching the world go by, Mrs. Cartwright surprised Michael by handing him a small, wrapped package. "What's this?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "Just a little something," she said with a smile. "Go on, open it." Inside was a fountain pen with a sleek black barrel and gold trim. It was old but well cared for, its surface polished to a shine. "This was Henry's," she explained. "He used it every day writing letters, jotting down notes. I think he'd like for you to have it." Michael hesitated, feeling the weight of the gesture. I can't take this. It's too much." "Nonsense," she said firmly. "You've given me far more than you realize. Just humor an old woman and take it." Michael finally accepted, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Mrs. Cartwright. I'll treasure it." Spring gave way to summer, and with it came new challenges. Mrs. Cartwright began to slow down noticeably. Her steps grew unsteady, and she often complained of feeling tired. Though she brushed off Michael's concern, he started visiting more frequently, bringing her fresh fruit from the market and making sure her medicine cabinet was stocked. One humid evening, as they sat in her parlor with the windows open to catch a breeze, Mrs. Cartwright leaned back in her chair and sighed. "You've been a blessing to me, Michael," she said. "More than you know." Michael smiled, but her tone made him uneasy. "You're not going anywhere anytime soon, Mrs. Cartwright," he said lightly. "You've got plenty of stories left to tell." She chuckled, but her laughter soon turned into a wistful smile. "Maybe so," she said, her voice tinged with a sadness Michael couldn't ignore. "But when my time does come, I'll go knowing I've made peace with this world, and knowing there's someone like you to carry on the things that matter." Michael didn't press her, but her words lingered in his mind. He sensed that she was preparing for something, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. All he knew was that he would be there for her, just as she had been there for him in her own way. What Michael didn't realize was that Mrs. Cartwright had been making plans that would soon come to light in ways that would take him completely by surprise. Summer turned to autumn, and Mrs. Cartwright's health declined further. Though she maintained her sharp wit and an occasional smile, her movements became slower and her voice weaker. Michael took it upon himself to visit her every day after school, not just to help with chores but to ensure she wasn't alone. They had developed a rhythm, sharing stories, sipping tea, and laughing about the peculiarities of life. One crisp October morning, as Michael arrived with a basket of apples from the farmer's market, Mrs. Cartwright greeted him with a faint smile. "You're too good to me, Michael," she said as he placed the basket on the kitchen counter. "It's no trouble," he replied. "I know how much you love fresh apples." She reached out to touch his arm, her hand trembling slightly. "You've been a gift to me. You know that, don't you?" Michael felt his throat tighten. "You've been a gift to me too, Mrs. Cartwright." They spent that afternoon in the parlor, with Michael reading aloud from one of her favorite novels while she rested in her chair. As the light outside faded, she suddenly spoke up. "Michael, there's something I need to tell you." He set the book down, sensing the gravity in her tone. "What is it?" "I've made arrangements," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "When my time comes, and it won't be long now, everything I have will go to you." Michael blinked, stunned. "Mrs. Cartwright, you don't have to." She held up a hand to silence him. "I don't have to, but I want to. I don't have family left, Michael. No children, no nieces or nephews. And I've lived long enough to see what really matters. You've shown me kindness when I had no one else. You've reminded me of the best in people. This house, my savings, it's all yours." Michael tried to protest, but she shook her head. "Don't argue with me, young man. You've earned it." Her words weighed on him heavily in the days that followed. Though he didn't know how to respond, he resolved to make her remaining time as comfortable as possible. He spent hours in her garden, pruning the hedges and planting bulbs for the spring. He cleaned her home, organized her bookshelves, and even cooked simple meals when she felt too weak to eat alone. Then, one chilly November evening, the inevitable happened. Michael arrived at Mrs. Cartwright's house to find the lights dim and her door unlocked. He called her name as he entered, but there was no response. Rushing to the parlor, he found her seated in her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked peaceful, as if she had simply fallen asleep. Tears blurred his vision as he knelt beside her. Though he had known this moment would come, the pain of losing her was sharp and immediate. He sat with her until help arrived, his heart heavy with grief and gratitude. The funeral was small but heartfelt, attended by a handful of neighbors who remembered Mrs. Cartwright as the formidable but kind-hearted teacher she had once been. Michael spoke briefly, sharing how much she had meant to him and how her kindness had shaped his life. As he spoke, he held the fountain pen she had given him, a reminder of the bond they had shared. A week after the funeral, Michael received a letter from Mrs. Cartwright's lawyer. He met with the lawyer in a quiet office downtown, listening intently as the will was read. Just as she had promised, Mrs. Cartwright had left him everything: the house, its contents, and a modest savings account. Michael felt overwhelmed by the enormity of her gift. "This house isn't just a place to live," he told his parents later that evening. "It's a piece of her life, her history. I want to honor that." As he moved into the house, Michael began to uncover more of Mrs. Cartwright's legacy. In the attic, he found journals filled with her thoughts and dreams, letters she had exchanged with her husband, and even a handwritten note addressed to him. "Michael," the note read, "I know you'll take care of this house and keep its spirit alive. It's not just bricks and wood, it's a place where kindness lives. I hope it becomes a haven for you and anyone else who needs it." Michael sat with the note for a long time, his heart full. He didn't know how he would fulfill her vision, but he vowed to try. Her trust in him was the greatest gift he had ever received, and he intended to honor it in every way he could. What he didn't realize was that her gift would ripple far beyond what either of them had imagined. Michael and his family moved into Mrs. Cartwright's house just as the first snow of the season began to fall. Their previous home, a cramped rental with creaky floors and drafty windows, had been a source of constant stress. Between the mounting medical bills for his mother's illness and his father's dwindling factory hours, the family had struggled to keep a roof over their heads. The rent had gone up again, and their landlord had warned them there would be no extensions on the next payment. When Mrs. Cartwright's will revealed that she had left the house to Michael, it wasn't just an act of kindness, it was a lifeline. Initially, Michael's parents were hesitant to accept such a gift. His father paced the tiny kitchen of their rental house, his calloused hands fidgeting with the edge of the table. "It doesn't feel right," he muttered. "Taking her house. Just like that. It's too much." Michael placed Mrs. Cartwright's letter on the table, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "She didn't just leave it for us to live in, Dad. She wanted us to take care of it, to use it for something good. This wasn't just about charity, it was her wish." His mother, sitting quietly at the table, looked over at the peeling wallpaper and the stack of unpaid bills on the counter. "Maybe she saw how much you cared for her, Michael," she said softly. "Maybe she knew you'd honor her memory." After much discussion, they agreed to move in, but not without a profound sense of humility. They packed up their belongings, just a few boxes of clothes, kitchenware, and the handful of items they'd managed to save over the years. As they approached the grand Victorian house, with its wide front porch and tall bay windows, it felt like stepping into another world. For Michael's mother, the house offered a chance to breathe again. She quickly claimed a corner of the sunny parlor, setting up her sewing machine and a basket of fabric scraps. It became her sanctuary, where she sewed blankets for the family and mended clothes for neighbors who couldn't afford new ones. Her quiet work filled the room with warmth, a stark contrast to the cold, anxious nights they had spent in the rental house. His father, though worn from years of grueling factory work, found a new sense of purpose in fixing up the house. The sagging shutters, peeling paint, and creaky floorboards were no match for his determination. "If we're going to live here," he said one evening, "hammer in hand, we're going to make it ours and keep it the way she would have wanted." For Michael, moving into the house brought a mix of emotions. It was a relief to see his family settling into a place where they could finally feel safe, but he couldn't ignore the responsibility that came with it. He spent his evenings exploring its many rooms, opening drawers and peering into dusty corners, learning more about Mrs. Cartwright's life with each discovery. One snowy afternoon, while sorting through the attic, Michael found a wooden trunk tucked beneath an old quilt. Inside, he discovered a second letter addressed to him. The envelope was thick and sealed with a wax stamp, its weight substantial in his hands. Sitting cross-legged on the attic floor, he carefully opened it and began to read. Michael. This house was my sanctuary, a place where I found peace and comfort after Henry passed. But it was always meant to be more than that. I dreamed of it becoming a place where kindness could grow, where people could come together to help one another. That dream felt too big for me to accomplish alone, but I see in you the heart and strength to make it a reality. You've already shown me that you care deeply about others, and I trust you to carry this forward. Use what I've left you wisely, not just for yourself, but for the good of those around you. The world needs places like this house where people can find refuge and connection, and it needs people like you to bring that vision to life. The words left Michael stunned. He sat in the attic for a long time, the letter resting on his lap as snow swirled outside the small window. This wasn't just a gift, it was a responsibility, one that went far beyond providing a home for his family. Mrs. Cartwright had seen something in him, something he wasn't sure he fully understood yet. That evening, he shared the letter with his parents. His mother wiped tears from her eyes, her voice trembling. "She saw what we've always known, Michael. You have a way of making people feel seen and cared for. She believed in you." His father, quiet for a moment, nodded. "If this was her dream, then we'll help you make it happen." Over the following weeks, Michael began reaching out to neighbors and local organizations. He explained Mrs. Cartwright's vision, sharing her dream of turning the house into a place where kindness and connection could thrive. The response was overwhelming. People who remembered Mrs. Cartwright as a teacher or a kind neighbor were eager to help. Volunteers arrived to clean and organize the house. Businesses donated supplies, and soon the old Victorian began to transform. The parlor became a cozy reading room, filled with donated books and comfortable chairs, where children could come after school for tutoring. The dining room was turned into a community kitchen, where meals were prepared for families in need. Even the garden, buried under snow, was cleared and prepared for planting in the spring, with plans to grow vegetables and flowers for the neighborhood. By the time spring arrived, the house was bustling with life. On the first warm day of the season, Michael organized an open house to welcome the community. People of all ages filled the rooms, sharing laughter and stories as they explored the space. One elderly man approached Michael in the reading room, holding a worn copy of Great Expectations. "I was one of her students," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Mrs. Cartwright always believed in making a difference. What you've done here, it's exactly what she would have wanted." Michael smiled, his heart full. "She taught me everything I know about kindness," he replied. As the sun set that evening, Michael stood on the porch, watching children chase each other across the lawn while adults chatted over cups of tea. The house, once quiet and lonely, was now alive with laughter and warmth. Mrs. Cartwright's dream had become a reality, and her trust in Michael had been more than fulfilled. In that moment, Michael felt a profound sense of purpose. This wasn't just a house, it was a living testament to the power of kindness and the legacy of a remarkable woman who had believed in him when it mattered most.